Hello, welcome to MOOC course on Environmental Humanities. We are discussing about environment as text in today's lecture. As you can see, the word text is very closely related to literature, it is related to language, and of course it is related to humanities. In the previous discussions, we explored the emergence of environmental humanities. I explained you about the interdisciplinary nature of environmental humanities. I gave you the various hows and whys of environmental crisis and how it cannot be understood only through scientific data. We have discussed so far how environmental issues are ecological, cultural, ethical, political and imaginative. We imagined the Anthropocene, and we also examined the Anthropocene and the urgent need to rethink humanity's relationship with the more than human world. Now we move into one of the most intellectually exciting concepts within environmental humanities, the idea that the environment itself can be understood as a text. First, this may sound very unusual. We are accustomed to thinking of texts as novels, poems, essays, newspapers, films or digital media. We generally associate reading with words. However, contemporary literary theory and cultural studies have significantly expanded our understanding of what constitutes a text. A text is not merely something written. A text is any system capable of generating meaning. From this perspective, landscapes, rivers, forests, mountains, gardens, agricultural fields, and even urban spaces. We should not leave out urban spaces because many a times we leave out urban spaces in the discussion of environment, which is something totally wrong. So they can be understood as texts because they communicate cultural, historical, ideological, and ecological meanings. Environmental humanities offers us to move beyond seeing nature as a passive backdrop. It invites us to see environments as active participants in meaning-making processes. So what we are going to discuss today are some basic questions. How do landscapes communicate meaning? How do literary texts represent environments? Can nature function as a narrative agent? How do metaphorical and material dimensions of nature interact within literature? What insights can Indian aesthetic traditions contribute to environmental interpretation? And finally, how can we develop methods for reading environment critically? So as we proceed, I want you to think not only as readers of literature but also as readers of landscapes. Every place you inhabit contains stories waiting to be interpreted. This discussion is telling us, motivating us to uncover those stories. We are accustomed to thinking of text as books and etc. But a text in conventional understanding is something written or spoken. How then can a forest be a text? How can a river be a text? How can a landscape be read? To answer this question, we must first broaden our understanding of what a text actually is. Contemporary literary theory, especially after structuralism and post-structuralism, has taught us that a text is not merely a written document. A text is any system that generates meaning, anything that can be interpreted, anything that communicates cultural significance, and anything that can be read may function as a text. When environmental humanities describe the environment as a text, they do not mean that forests literally contain sentences or rivers literally write stories. Rather, they mean that environments are repositories of meanings, histories, symbols, ideologies, memories, and narratives that can be interpreted in much the same way that we interpret literary works. Imagine for a moment that you are standing beside the Yamuna river. What exactly you see? At one level you see flowing water, But at another level, you encounter layers upon layers of meaning. You encounter religious traditions. You encounter memories of civilizations. You encounter histories of urbanization. You encounter stories of pollution and ecological degradation. You encounter policies, economic activities, cultural practices, spiritual beliefs. The river, therefore, becomes much more than a physical object. It becomes a cultural text. So, we need to recognize these multiple layers of meaning. So, the perspective is closely connected with semiotics, the study of science and signification. Just as words function as signs that generate meaning, environmental features also function symbolically. Mountains may symbolize permanence, rivers may symbolize continuity and change, forests may symbolize mystery, freedom, abundance, danger, or spiritual renewal, depending upon cultural context. The environmental humanist therefore approaches landscapes not simply as physical spaces but as systems of cultural communication. The idea has profound implications. For centuries, Western intellectual traditions often separated nature from culture. Nature was seen as external reality, while culture belonged to the human sphere. Environmental humanities challenges this division by showing how cultural meanings are always embedded within environmental perception. The environment we perceive is never purely natural. It is always mediated through stories, language, memory, religion, art, policies, and ideologies. This is why different societies can look at the same landscapes and see entirely different things. Environmental humanities. To understand this concept, we must first revisit the notion of textuality. During the 20th century, literary theorists such as Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, and others challenged how narrow definitions of text were. They argued that meaning is not confined to books and written language. Cultural practices, institutions, rituals, visual images, and landscapes can all be interpreted as texts because they generate meaning. So, we need to extend this insight into ecological contexts. When we describe the environment as a text, we do not suggest that forest is transforming into some kind of linguistic entity. Rather, we argue that environments communicate meanings that can be interpreted. Like I gave you the example of river Yamuna, or take the example of river Ganga. It functions as an ecological system, a sacred entity, a cultural symbol, economic resource, political concern. And so many communities living on the banks of river Ganga and Yamuna in different regions of India read the same river differently. Religious practitioners emphasize so many spiritual significance. Historians are working on it. Artists celebrate its beauty. So the river becomes a complex text containing multiple layers of meaning. This idea resonates strongly with eco-critical theory. Cheryl Glotfelty famously defined eco-criticism as the study of relationship between literature and the physical environment. And this definition appears simple, but it is fundamentally transforming the literary analysis. So literary criticism now should not treat nature as background scenery. Rather, it becomes a core text. It offers the core textuality. So the environment becomes both a physical reality as well as a cultural text. The theoretical foundations in this area are, we must see these things. One of the central insights of eco-criticism is that human relationships with nature are never neutral. They are shaped by language, ideology, culture, religion, economics, and politics. This recognition constitutes what many scholars describe as the eco-critical turn. Before eco-criticism emerged, literary studies largely focused on social and human-centered concerns. Environmental questions occupied a marginal position. So, eco-criticism challenged this anthropocentric orientation. Anthropocentrism refers to the tendency to place humans at the center of value systems. Within anthropocentric frameworks, nature often appears only insofar as it serves human interests. Eco-criticism questions this assumption. It asks us to consider non-human entities as meaningful participants within cultural and ecological systems. Lawrence Buell's work is especially important here. Lawrence Buell argues that reducing nature entirely to discourse is very problematic. Some strands of post-structuralist theory emphasize textuality so strongly that material reality sometimes appeared secondary. Buell warns against this tendency. Forests are not merely cultural constructs, rivers are not merely metaphors, climate change is not merely discourse. Material ecological realities exist and exert significant influence. At the same time, our understanding of these realities is always mediated through language and culture. Environmental humanities therefore reject simplistic oppositions. Nature is neither purely material nor purely textual. It exists within dynamic interactions between ecological realities and cultural meanings. So, we need to examine how environmental metaphors influence environmental behavior. How we imagine nature shapes how we treat nature. If forests are imagined as resources, exploitation becomes easier. If forests are imagined as communities of life, conservation becomes more compelling. So this insight highlights the ethical significance of environmental representation. Language matters, stories matter, metaphors matter. These representational processes possess processes of studies that we are right now talking of. Environmental humanities and eco-criticism is the argument that nature is not merely a backdrop, which I have discussed many times before. Rather, nature often functions as a narrative agent, an active force that shapes events, influences decisions, transforms characters, and even determines the direction of stories. Traditional literary criticism often treated nature as secondary. The focus remained firmly on human characters and their relationships. The landscape was frequently viewed as decorative scenery, an aesthetic background against which human emotions and conflicts were projected. So this is fundamentally challenged in this discussion. Look at example. If a novel is set in the Sahara Desert, and another is set in the Sundarbans mangrove forest, even before we know the characters, the environment has already begun shaping the narrative possibilities. Survival strategies, social relationships, cultural practices, fears, aspirations, and even language will differ dramatically because the environment itself influences human life. This is precisely what environmental humanities encourages us to recognize. The environment is not passive. The environment acts. The environment influences. The environment participates. So, one of the characteristics of environmentally oriented literature is that non-human environment is present not merely as framing device but as a presence that affects narrative development. This means that forests, rivers, oceans, mountains, weather systems and animals can function as agents within narratives. Look at Thomas Hardy's The Return of the Native. Many critics have observed that Edgar Heath is arguably more important than many of the human characters. The Heath shapes emotions, relationships, opportunities, limitations, and destinies. It possesses a presence so powerful that it becomes almost a character in its own right. Similarly, in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, the wild Yorkshire moors profoundly influence the novel's atmosphere. emotional intensity, and thematic concerns. The landscape is inseparable from the narrative self. Environmental humanities extends this insight beyond literature. Think about floods, droughts, cyclones, earthquakes, and pandemics. These events frequently alter the course of human history. The COVID-19 pandemic reminded humanity that non-human agencies continue to shape human destinies in profound ways. In Hungry Tide, we see an excellent contemporary example. The Sundarbans are not merely a setting. The tides, rivers, storms, crocodiles, dolphins, and shifting landscapes actively shape the lives of characters. Human plants constantly encounter environmental forces that exceed human control. Environmental humanities therefore challenges anthropocentrism, the belief that humans are the sole agents of significance. Instead, it proposes a more relational understanding of agency. Agency becomes distributed across networks of humans and non-humans. Animals influence human behavior, weather influences social systems, rivers influence settlement patterns, forests influence cultural identities. Nature is no longer silent. Nature participates in storytelling. This realization has important ethical implications. If nature is understood as an active participant rather than a passive object, then our relationship with the environment must also change. The environment becomes a partner in existence rather than merely a resource for exploitation. As environmental crises intensify globally, this shift in perspective becomes increasingly important. So, we need to read narratives differently. Whenever we encounter a literary text, we should ask, how does the environment shape events? What forms of agency are attributed to nature? How do non-human forces influence human destinies? By asking these questions, we begin to uncover ecological dimensions that traditionally literary criticism often overlooked. Now, let us examine three closely related but distinct concepts that are central to landscape, setting, and atmosphere. These terms are often used interchangeably in everyday discussion, but from an eco-critical perspective, each performs a different function. Landscape. It refers to the visible features of an environment. Mountains, rivers, forests, fields, deserts, coastlines, and urban spaces all constitute landscapes. However, this discussion that we are having, it reminds us that landscapes are never merely physical realities. Landscapes are culturally produced ways of seeing around us. What appears beautiful, what appears sacred, threatening, productive, or valuable often depends on our cultural assumptions. For example, colonial administrators frequently viewed forests as resources to be managed and exploited. Indigenous communities often viewed the same forests as ancestral homelands. The physical landscape remained the same. What differed was the cultural interpretation. This insight reveals that landscapes are both material and cultural phenomena. Now look at the setting, the word setting. Setting refers to the specific spatial and temporal context within which a narrative unfolds. Setting includes not only place but also historical conditions. A forest in a pre-colonial society functions differently from a forest under colonial administration. A river before industrialization carries different meanings from a river after industrial pollution. Environmental humanities encourages to understand settings historically. Places are never static. They possess histories. Every landscape contains traces of previous human and non-human interactions. Environmental interpretation requires attention to these temporal dimensions. Third thing is atmosphere. Atmosphere refers to the emotional mood generated by environmental representation. Atmosphere often operates subtly but powerfully. Think of the difference between a mist-covered forest at dawn and a drought-stricken landscape under intense heat. Both environments evoke distinct emotional responses. Atmosphere shapes how readers feel. It influences interpretation at both conscious and unconscious levels. In Gothic literature, dark forests, ruined castles, and stormy weather often generate feelings of fear and uncertainty. In Romantic literature, mountains, rivers, and forests frequently evoke wonder and awe and spiritual transcendence. Indian literary traditions similarly employ environmental imagery to generate emotional states associated with ras. Nature therefore functions not only descriptively but affectively. Environmental humanities is offering us to examine how landscapes, settings, and atmospheres contribute to meaning making processes. When reading a text, we should ask, why has the author chosen the particular environment? How does the setting shape narrative possibilities? What emotional atmosphere is being created? What cultural assumptions are embedded within landscape descriptions? Through such questions, environmental interpretation becomes more nuanced and sophisticated. Now, nature as metaphor. Let us turn to one of the oldest and most fascinating functions of nature in literature, its role as metaphor. When we speak of nature as metaphor, we are referring to the way natural phenomena are used to express human emotions, philosophical ideas, social conditions, spiritual experiences, and psychological states. Throughout literary history, nature has functioned as a vast symbolic language through which human beings have interpreted themselves and the world around them. In many ways, nature constitutes humanity's oldest vocabulary. Before modern psychology existed, people described emotional turbulence through storms. Before sophisticated sociological theories emerged, communities explained cycles of prosperity and decline through seasonal metaphors. Before modern environmental science, people often understood cosmic order through observations of river, mountain, tree, animal, and celestial body. Literature reflects this long history of symbolic thinking. So think of how frequently we use natural metaphors in everyday speech. We speak of weathering a crisis, we describe someone's personality as sunny, we refer to roots when discussing family history, we speak of branches of knowledge, we describe emotional breakdowns as storms. These expressions reveal how deeply nature structures human thought. Environmental humanities asks us to pay careful attention to these symbolic relationships. Again, going back to river, one of the most common metaphors in world literature is river as life itself. A river flows continuously, never remaining exactly the same, yet retaining its identity. Human life is often imagined similarly. From Heraclitus' famous observation that one cannot step into the same river twice, to Indian philosophical traditions emphasizing impermanence and flow, rivers have served as powerful metaphors for existence. Similarly, trees frequently symbolize continuity, memory, ancestry, and growth. Family trees, genealogical roots, branching futures all rely upon arboreal imagery. Family trees, genealogical roots, branching futures all rely upon arboreal imagery. The tree becomes a symbolic model through which human beings understand relationships and identities. The changing seasons provide another rich source of metaphorical meaning. Spring often symbolizes birth, renewal, hope. Summer suggests maturity and abundance. Autumn evokes transition and decline. Winter signifies dormancy, mortality, or reflection. These associations appear across literary traditions and cultures in their own way. They may be different. In Romantic literature, nature often functions as a mirror of emotional experience. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Keats repeatedly used natural imagery to explore consciousness and memory. as well as imagination. Wordsworth's landscapes are never merely physical locations, they become sites of spiritual insight and psychological transformation. Indian literary traditions offer equally sophisticated example. Kalidas's Ritu Samhar uses seasonal change to explore emotional states and human relationships. In Sanskrit aesthetics, nature frequently participates in the creation of ras or aesthetic emotion. The natural world becomes intertwined with human feeling. Tagore's poetry similarly transforms rivers, flowers, clouds, and birds into vehicles for philosophical and spiritual reflection. His natural imagery often gestures towards transcendence, interconnectedness, and the mystery of existence. At this point, this discipline introduces an important question. What happens when nature becomes only metaphor? What are the limitations of symbolic interpretations? Historically, literary criticism often focused almost exclusively on metaphorical meanings. A forest became a symbol of unconscious desire, a river became a symbol of time, a mountain became a symbol of transcendence. While these interpretations remain valuable, eco-critics argue that they sometimes obscure actual environmental realities. If a forest exists only as a metaphor, what happens to the real forest? What happens to biodiversity? What happens to ecological systems? What happens to deforestation? This question leads us directly into the discussion where we explore that nature not merely is as a symbol but as a material reality. So, having examined nature as metaphor, we now think of the second half of this debate, that is nature as material reality. This shift represents one of the most important interventions made by environmental humanities and eco-criticism. For much of literary history, nature was frequently interpreted through symbolic frameworks. Forests symbolized mystery, storms symbolized emotional conflict, mountains symbolized spiritual aspiration. While such readings remain important, environmental scholars argue that they are no longer sufficient. Why? Because we live in an era of ecological crisis. Climate change is not a metaphor. Species extinction is not a metaphor. Pollution is not a metaphor. Deforestation is not a metaphor. Environmental degradation affects real ecosystems, real communities, and real lives. Consequently, environmental humanities insists that literary interpretation must remain attentive to material ecological realities. The concept of dual accountability by Lawrence Buell becomes a particularly significant concept here. According to Buell, environmental texts are accountable both to discourse and to matter. In other words, literary representations of nature carry symbolic meanings, but they also refer to actual environmental conditions. This dual awareness distinguishes eco-critical reading from earlier approaches. Let us consider drought. In many literary works, drought may symbolize despair, spiritual emptiness, or social breakdown. However, drought is also a material phenomenon. It affects agriculture, it influences migration pattern, it creates economic hardship, it reshapes ecosystems. And eco-critical reading therefore attends to both dimensions simultaneously. Similarly, when contemporary novels describe floods, storms, or rising sea levels, they often engage environmental realities that increasingly characterize the Anthropocene. In Hungry Tide, the tidal ecology of the Sundarbans is not simply symbolic. It is a material force shaping human existence. Characters must constantly negotiate environmental unpredictability. Their lives are inseparable from ecological processes. Climate fiction, sometimes called as cli-fi, has become particularly important in this context. Contemporary writers increasingly address environmental issues such as climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and ecological collapse. So these challenge readers to recognize the material dimensions of environmental crisis. So we need to reconnect literature with physical world. Texts do not float above reality. They emerge from specific ecological context. Writers inhabit environments. Readers inhabit environments. Narratives reflect environmental conditions. Environmental crises influence cultural productions. Another important aspects concern environmental justice. Material environmental harms are not distributed equally. Pollution often affects marginalized communities disproportionately. Climate change impacts vulnerable populations more severely. Environmental humanities therefore examines how environmental realities intersect with race, class, gender, caste, colonialism, and inequality. Nature as material reality thus expands literary interpretation beyond symbolism toward ethics and politics. Ultimately, environmental humanities does not ask us to choose between metaphor and materiality. Rather, it is asking us, inviting us to recognize their interaction, the long overlooked. The nature is simultaneously symbolic and material. A river may symbolize life journey, but it is also a living ecosystem. A forest may symbolize freedom, but it is also a habitat. A storm may symbolize conflict, but it is also a meteorological event with real consequences. The challenge of environmental interpretation lies in holding these dimensions together. This capacity to think simultaneously about meaning and matter represents one of the defining strengths of environmental humanities. So before I wind up today's discussion, this lecture, I would like you to invite practical exercises, because it is not only about reading books, it is about learning how to read the world around us. So this is asking you to become both a literary critic and an environmental observer. So you can do these activities. They are written on the screen. Begin by selecting a familiar environment. It may be a university campus, a public park, a roadside landscape, a village pond, a neighborhood garden, or even the area immediately surrounding your homes. Spend some time there carefully, observe, notice details that are often overlooked. What sounds dominate? Birds, vehicles, construction activities. What signs of environmental change can you identify? So ask these questions and observe relationships rather than isolated objects. Now the next thing is, try to read this environment as a text. Imagine that landscape is telling a story. What story is it telling? Is it a story of development? Is it a story of environmental degradation? A story of coexistence? A story of loss? A story of resilience? Then connect your observations with literature. Choose any literary text you know and examine how nature functions within it. Does nature operate symbolically? Does it possess agency? Does the text acknowledge ecological realities? Finally, write a reflective piece, or maybe you record a voice, a video reflecting on it, connecting environmental observations with literary interpretation. So this will embody the central objectives of this course, which is learning to see connections between texts, cultures, histories, and environment. So thank you. I hope you will enjoy doing what I have suggested. These are the references that we have discussed so far. Thank you very much.